My name is Mete. I'm from My Life, My Say, which is the organisation there. Tele is our engagement manager, and I'm the founder and CEO. I guess I'll tell you a bit about what we do as an organisation, and Tele will specifically talk to you about how this specific Democracy Cafe will run. What I would say is that this is a very different Democracy Cafe to what we're usually accustomed to. Just to give you a better understanding of how we do these Democracy Cafes normally, My Life, My Say runs it in partnership with Starbucks, with the coffee company, and we run them all across the UK, different parts of Europe, and also in the United States of America too. And the whole purpose of the Democracy Cafes is to reinvigorate the 17th century concept of talking about politics over coffee in less formal settings, so that our target group is young people. We don't obviously exclude other groups from participating, but the whole idea is that we know that young people typically don't engage in formal traditional methods of politics, and what we try to do is reduce barriers by removing, for example, the need to wear a suit, for example, or for example, going into, not that there's anything wrong with wearing a suit, but also, when you go to a formal institution that you haven't been to before, you may feel a bit uncomfortable to kind of speak your mind. So the reason why the coffee shop works really well is because our approach to engagement is trying to identify where young people go to in their day-to-day, their social and their digital lives, and think about how we can connect with them in those spaces. So that's why the Democracy Cafe works really well. So we've delivered over 500 since 2015. More than 90% of our events have taken place outside of London. So a real niche of My Life, My Say, and what we do is really specifically make sure that we're going to marginalised communities and communities where people don't often get the opportunity to have their voice. We've delivered 14 across Europe, and at the start of this year we delivered some in the United States, but we were hoping to run them in the run-up to the presidential elections, but obviously because of COVID, we've now changed them to take place online. What I will do just before Tele runs you through how the Democracy Cafe will run, I will kind of give you just a bit of background about our organisation. So My Life, My Say predominantly exists to increase the participation of young people in democracy, recognising that young people do care about issues. So of course they care about climate change and about their living standards, but the problem is that they don't see traditional forms of politics as a vehicle to address the issues that they care about. And part of the reasons for that is because obviously we're not educated about how democracy works, particularly in the context of the UK. Secondly, because politics tends to not be representative of society, so there's an automatic barrier when young people look at our people who govern us and don't really find them relatable. And thirdly, partly as well, is because obviously politicians have let down people over the years, so people have lost that level of trust. So we do that in three ways. So firstly, we have the engagement arm, which is partly what we're doing here today, which is partly around the Democracy Cafes that we're doing. We're also currently we're working with the United States State Department and also with the US Embassy in London to broadcast the US elections to young people in the UK. So that's one project that we're doing at the moment. So we do lots of different events and projects that are centered around trying to engage young people's voices into decision making. And we also have our advocacy arm. So soon after the very famous Brexit referendum, we set up the all-party parliamentary group on a better Brexit for young people, which was a convening of 43 British MPs across the political spectrum and also across the Brexit spectrum. So you had people who wanted to leave with no deal, MPs who wanted to remain in the European Union. We had an MP who was our chair actually who wanted a Norway-style Brexit. So we have to make sure we have that because we're a non-partisan charity. We don't seek to influence the views of young people, and also we're youth-led. So we just have to make sure that we are representative of all the different types of groups that exist. And we were commissioned by the European Union and the UK government to carry out nationwide consultation on what a Brexit looks like, and we published 2 reports subsequently with the London School of Economics, we met with Michel Barnier and lots of other sort of negotiators specifically around that, and then following that the UK government committed to Erasmus Plus, which was one of our key asks. And then we also have a bit of leadership work, so we train young people across the country, specifically around voter registration. My Life, My Say is widely recognised as one of the significant contributors to increasing turnout and voter registration in 2017 and 2019. We worked with big tech companies like Uber and Tinder to increase voter registration. You may be thinking, how on earth did you work with Tinder? But what we were doing was, as you're swiping left or right on Tinder, if you're aged between 18 and 24, it gave you a notification to say, have you registered to vote? If not, swipe right. If you swipe right, it will take you to the UK government voter registration website. So those are some very sort of innovative things that we've been part of, and the whole aim is going back to what I said right at the start, which is about trying to identify where do young people go to and trying to get into those spaces rather than trying to create a space with My Life, My Say and bringing people to us. But I'll pass it over to Tele now, who will talk to you about this specific session.
Hello everybody, my name is Tele Lawal. I'm a politician in the UK, similar to Mete, but my other hat is engagement manager. So my job at My Life, My Say is day to day I'm creating sessions and projects like this with our partners. A lot of our sessions are around democratic processes, participation, the engagement, and looking at how we can engage not just young people, as Mete said, but other people in democracy, and seeing how we can encourage people to really say, you know, this is my basic human right and I want to continue to exercise that. So we do our democracy cafes. Obviously due to the pandemic we've been doing them online, but they've been working very well, utilising Zoom and the breakout rooms. So it's kind of nice to be in a room with people and actually running this workshop. Today, this session, what we're going to do is we're going to have 3 rounds. We like to do it very quickly. This is kind of formal for us. As Mete said, we usually do it in a coffee shop because it's supposed to be relaxed, allow people to share their views, and so we can gain that invaluable insight. So the first round is talking about the context. How is democracy participated within your respective countries? So we'll all kind of find out a little bit more about each other. And since the pandemic, how has that changed? In my area, for example, I live in London, in a borough called Havering, and now we just have executive decisions being made without very little scrutiny due to the pandemic, and those decisions have to be made very quickly. So that's very different from sitting in the council chamber and everyone, you know, kind of arguing with each other and doing debates. And then we're going to go on to the second round, which is talking about the barriers. So what are the barriers now that prevent people from exercising their democratic right and also engaging in that civic space? So as some of us know, there's a digital divide. That's been a huge one in London. A lot of people haven't been able to exercise their democracy. Most people are just finding out what's happening from their neighbour or in the news. The next thing that we're going to do is the best one, and I love this, is the solutions. Democracy for me now, during this pandemic, we've seen kind of the inequalities and the issues. So for myself, I've been sitting down thinking, how can I make sure that my citizens are really being involved in democracy and what's happening at a local level, let alone national. So I think for us, I'm sure during this whole conference, we've really been thinking about those solutions and how democracy is being exercised and what it's going to look like in the future, because this pandemic has really shown us that we do need to look at kind of the issues and how we solve them. So that's how this workshop is going to run today. It's very relaxed, informal, so get your coffee, get your water, and just enjoy and get comfortable.
Yeah, we don't have Starbucks coffee, but we do
have
very luxury coffee.
Espresso machine over there. So the first thing we do is an icebreaker, because we all like to get to know each other.
Yeah. And
it's called 2 Truths and 1 Lie. So Mete is going to give an example of the icebreaker, and then I'll do one, and then we'll go over to you to have a go.
Yeah. So so we're going to read 3 statements, and then you have to guess which are the 2 truths and a lie. So the first one is, I was elected as a councillor at the age of 21, as the youngest ever councillor in the UK. The second one is, I arrived in Greece last week. And the third one is, I am married and have a son who's 2 years old.
Can anyone guess the lie?
Second one.
Like we arrived in Greece last week, we didn't arrive last week.
The third one.
Yeah, it's right. So I actually arrived in Greece last week, Thursday.
Yeah, probably because you told us earlier.
Yeah. Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
I'll do one for you. I'm the first ever black female to be elected in London Borough of Havering. I'm a twin. I arrived in Greece on Tuesday. Which one is the lie? I've got a good poker face. 2.
You arrived in Greece on Tuesday.
I arrived in Greece on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Number 2. Oh, it's like an auction.
I'm a twin, that's it.
I'm a twin. Okay.
Because you arrived together as well.
Twin. Oh, everyone's right. No, I'm not a twin. I wish I was. But yeah, that's how it is. So we'll throw it over to yourselves and have a go. Who wants to go first?
Should I go first?
Okay, go.
Yeah.
I sleepwalk. I was born in Lebanon. I studied international development studies.
I speak
First one.
Yeah, first.
First one.
I used to, I
And please share your name. I don't know if everybody knows each
Yeah,
other, but
yeah.
yeah, share your name.
Henry, would you like to? Yeah.
Sure. So, I was born in a country that no longer exists. I live in Berlin, and I don't like pickles.
You love pickles. There, yeah.
The third one.
Yeah.
No, the first one. I was born in the GDR, which technically doesn't exist anymore.
What is it?
Yeah. Well, no, that's true.
I guess in the lie. Oh, yeah. That's true. Then you're right.
I
sorry.
could see what you
Yes.
were trying to do with that question.
No,
So
then
the lie
pickles
was
is
the
right.
pickles.
The pickles.
Okay,
were
good.
right,
Yeah,
yes.
I like pickles.
Who doesn't like pickles?
I like pickles. Yeah.
I'll do this, and then I have to go after this. I'm sorry, but I'll be back. So, let's see. I hold several passports. I have moved around the world living in several countries. And I love salads made with okra.
Salads with okra.
Salad
Salad
with
with okra.
We kind of knew the
Yeah,
answer already.
salad with okra.
I will be back.
No problem, thank you.
Thank you. Alison?
Okay. I have two daughters. My husband is a concert pianist from Russia, and I love Greece.
This is number one.
Yeah.
Number one.
I'm guessing all of them, right? Is there an award or something?
He would literally know I'm bluffing. Oh.
We should start a competition. I'm fine.
I'm Joe. So, number one, I speak 5 languages. Number 2, I'm the youngest yoga instructor in Europe. And number 3, I have 25 cats.
Oh.
I really hope it's the cats.
You have to prove that.
You have 25 cats?
25 cats.
Oh, wow.
It's a very big house.
Well, then it's number 2. That's number 2.
What was number 2?
The yoga instructor.
No, it's true too.
You're the youngest yoga instructor?
Yeah,
Oh.
So
you
what
must-
was number 1?
it's number 1. Yeah.
What was it?
I speak 5 languages.
5
Ah,
languages.
you don't speak 5.
She only speaks 4.
6. Oh, wow.
Wow.
I think that was the best one.
Yeah, that was the best one. Yeah, I did not expect that. Yeah.
That's our icebreaker. Just
Kim?
relax. Kim, yes.
Yeah, Kim.
Kim, are you
3
gonna
things,
go?
2 truths, 1 lie.
Okay, let's think about this. My husband's Canadian. I have 4 children. And I have never been to mainland China.
You've never
I
been
think
to
it's
mainland China.
I didn't have time to think.
He's
You
really
took
good.
it.
Yeah,
I don't
really
know.
good,
I feel like you prepared.
Not at all, actually, for today.
He's definitely worked the room around.
I know, he's spoken to everybody. I know. Too much. But yeah, that's our icebreaker. I feel like I know everyone a little bit more. Yoga instructor, coming to you. It's good. So now we're going to go for the first round. This will be 10 minutes, and it's just a formal chat. So it's talking about deciding who makes the decisions. So we just want to know, how has democracy participated in your respective countries before the pandemic, and what changes have you seen during the pandemic? So let's kick off.
Yeah.
I can start with myself. So like I said, at local government in my town hall, we'd obviously have our general meetings before decisions are made. Now, unfortunately, it's just the administration, and then we don't really get to scrutinise. And as well for our residents, they don't get to attend the town hall to kind of see the debates and these decisions being implemented. So that's kind of the changes that I've seen since the pandemic.
Okay. Um,
We'll sit down as well, make it more
Yeah.
relaxed. Yeah.
There is a very big issue in Greece, mainly that young people, as I have seen, we don't know what on earth is happening here in Greece with politics. Now, friends of mine studying international relations and so on might have some idea, but friends of mine and people my age that aren't studying anything politics related, like myself, because I'm a pre-med student, we never had any contact with it whatsoever. We just knew that we have a democracy here. We knew who was prime minister, and maybe who was president of the Democratic Party. We just know that. Now, many people were content, very content, happy with how our prime minister actually dealt with the COVID problem. Because we had many measures imposed and we caught up with it very fast, so we didn't have a lot of cases in the beginning. But honestly, I can't see how many things have changed with our politics here and democracy and so on. Because I was never very, very involved with it because I didn't know anything what was going on. And I basically understood how much I was ignorant of what was going on in my country when I got accepted into this, to participate here. So, yeah.
Interesting.
So the lack of like education generally about?
Very, very large lack of education on young people. I don't know about older people. I hope they do know what's going on. But yeah, we don't discuss it. When it comes to politics, we might even know more about what's going on in the US because of social media and so on, and memes and I don't know what, than what is actually going on in Greece, which I think is very bad. And it's not doing us any good. That's what
Alison, what about the US? What's happening?
Alison, did you see the news this morning?
Oh, about Trump, yeah.
No.
Are we good now?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that you all think that I can tell you about the United States, where I certainly do live, but where I do not have the vote. In fact, I have no right to vote anywhere. Because the UK, which I discovered when the Brexit referendum was looming, if you haven't lived in the UK for more than 15 years, you are automatically deprived of your right to vote. And there are over 1 million people who fall into that category. And I don't know why more fuss isn't made about this, because it's pretty clear that people who live internationally would probably have voted to stay. But let's be generous and say they voted only 50% to stay in the European Union. It still would have been 500,000 votes.
Yeah.
And I don't know why this issue has not been trumpeted from the rooftops, honestly.
Why?
I had no idea.
Yeah.
This is quite normal for like overseas citizens to vote, like as in like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what if you went back to to the
Well,
UK?
I mean, if I started to live in the UK,
you would-
presumably I could at some point get a right to vote, but I honestly don't know what the position is.
But I mean, can I just be the devil's advocate? I mean, the logic, 15 years not living in a country, hence not voting, strikes me as possibly being, this person has no longer a vested interest in that country's populace.
Absolutely. And as far as domestic politics were concerned, it didn't bother me that I didn't have the right to vote, because why should I vote, in fact, on certain issues in a country where I don't pay taxes and I don't live? But when it affects my ability to work in the country where I have been living, which in the case at the time was Germany, there should be some way to participate. And it's kind of ridiculous, because if I was to start making a fuss, people would say, but you've been the editor of this major European newspaper and this and that, so what are you complaining about?
It's interesting what you said, because when you were speaking, Joe, you were saying how even though you can live in a country, you may not have any kind of understanding in what's happening, and you feel because of social media you're more connected to US politics. So based on that, maybe because of social media and the information out there, people do still feel connected even if they're not present?
Well, I think, to judge by my daughter, for instance, you know, she is at least as concerned with what happened in the Breonna Taylor case as other issues of politics. And I just found that interesting. And when Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed, Lucy was arranging to watch the documentary about her with a friend of hers, but at the same time she was equally concerned about Breonna. And I think that social media gives people the idea, possibly the illusion, that they are participating in United States politics. What they're doing is following very closely a stream of pieces of information that get hurled at you, and you get the idea that that constitutes participating in the politics, but it doesn't really. What you're doing is much more relevant in that way, and I just wonder if you are sort of monitoring the degree to which decisions are being passed on through only administrative bodies. Are you able to monitor that UK-wide, or?
So we have.
And do you have any indication that people in, say, France are doing the same thing?
Yeah, so we have like the way in which we kind of like monitor how impactful our work is. So we have a number of ways. So one is we measure impact in terms of the impact we have on the young people that we work with. So in terms of their attitudes, behaviours, and their knowledge. We do that through like pre and post testing of the participants and sort of carrying out case studies with participants and trying to measure, you know, their attitudes before coming to along or participating in our activities and then after. And then we also do, when we organise these democracy cafes, like obviously today we're just, you know, doing it kind of to showcase it, and that's why we're invited by that Democracy Forum. But one of the things that we're really conscious with, we do at My Life My Say, is we don't just organise it for the sake of doing it. So what we'll do is we'll work with, like, for example, like at the moment we're working with the United Nations Democracy Fund, and specifically helping feed their, shape their youth engagement strategy. So any work that we do, we tend to team up with an institution that helps kind of feed into a consultation process. So, because the last thing we want to do is to bring people into a room where they tend to not be, you know, bear in mind the type of people we're trying to reach are people who are not engaged so much in traditional forms of politics. So if you convince them to come to an event and then it's just a talk shop, they will get put off more in the long term because you can't really demonstrate how what they've said has made an impact. So we always try to feed it into a consultation process and make sure that we can take it back to them and say, as a result of these events, here is how, let's say, the UK Parliament or whoever it is have taken into account what you said, and these are the things that they've done. And then it's up to them whether they want to take that further as a campaign, to further campaign around that issue. So we try to eliminate the idea of having it as a talk shop. So we do that in ways of monitoring sort of the consultation processes, basically. Yeah, but yeah, so, sorry.
Your mic.
Oh, it's my microphone. Okay. So yeah, that's the way in which we tend to sort of do it. But it's interesting what you say about the whole social media, because I was listening to a talk by Obama, which you should, if you haven't come across it, but he has this really good talk, which he was doing once. It's like 2 years ago, where he was talking about the idea of activism and what the new generation sort of perceived to be activism, which is that basically, you know, if you do a couple of tweets, automatically you perceive yourself to be an activist, whereas actually, you know, like, being an activist is a very different thing. And he talks about the impact of social media on the culture of politics and this sort of new woke culture and stuff. So Obama has, I'll send you a link on that talk. I think he specifically talks about what you're talking about, which is very true and interesting. Yeah. Henry?
So what has changed in German politics because of COVID? I think 4 things mainly. Number one, what you also described on your local experience, it's the time of the executive. So, you know, the legislative has been kind of locked out of decision-making processes, which in short-term times of crisis is a reasonable approach, but if it lasts too long, it damages democracy. The second is the role of science in politics. You know, like never as openly and as critically was scientific knowledge discussed in the political process as a basis of evidence-based policy making. And we always joke in Germany, if there's a World Cup, we have 80 million soccer coaches. Now we have 80 million epidemiologists. Everybody knows everything better. And then I think the third, I would say, is that the role of politics is kind of to manage the crisis, but not to shape the future, which normally should be the role of politics. So it's not about where Germany is in 5 years or 10 years. It's about how do we get to the next month, and that changes things. And I think the last thing, and that's I think a European phenomenon, is the resurgence of borders. How all of a sudden, I was born in a border region. All of a sudden, there are borders coming up that we thought no longer existed.
Yeah.
Because everybody was afraid of the virus, which was coming by the foreigners. Obviously, it had to commute somehow, and so the reflex of everybody was to build up walls again instead of cooperating, which could have been the other option globally if it's a pandemic.
That's really interesting. Well, I don't know what country to speak about because I am from Lebanon, Palestinian, and Canadian. The Canada part, I'm going to put aside a bit because I haven't lived there this year. But Lebanon, I think the pandemic was obviously and clearly to us, it was a gift that was given to the politicians of Lebanon because from October 17th to February, it was the protests taking over the streets, Prime Minister resigning, groups are getting organized. That spirit of democracy finally has started entering Lebanon. And it was clear in every conversation had with anyone that we're going on the right track. Then once the pandemic started, the government not only shut down the protests and all this, but the language of fear was used across and strictly, and even fact-checking some of the politicians' statements was so wrong, like what they were saying was so wrong, just to maximize that fear. And it helped them. I mean, the pandemic is the best thing that the politicians of Lebanon could have asked for, because it was the only way that they could tell people stay at home and for the next few months, you have no say. And then on the other hand, the internet was, I live in Beirut, in the center of Beirut, and I noticed that starting with the pandemic time that I couldn't access the internet as fast or as I used to. So I think with the pandemic, the government's manipulation to the web, even WhatsApp, I was sending, I would send messages and it wouldn't go through. So I think the pandemic plus their agenda managed to destabilize the entire movement of what people were asking for. And same thing applies for Palestine and Israel, because Netanyahu was supposed to be heading to court. And then the pandemic starts and Netanyahu is a hero. So from a man of corruption to a man of accolades for saving the nation and all these measures. So yeah, I can see how the political arena of the Middle East fed off, because these are dictators, and a dictator speaks the language of fear, and then the virus is all about fear. Put two together, bingo.
It's interesting what you said in terms that the pandemic has very much destabilized a lot of movements, and that now you're seeing leaders using the fear of language and using that misinformation, because a lot of people, I'm not going to talk about the theories, but a lot of people who have said, COVID-19 is being used as a weapon for leaders to control the mass, and the fact that you've just said that's what you're seeing in your country, that a movement has now stopped because of the measures put in place. It's just interesting in that way.
Yeah, I think I've been just, I'm in Lebanon as I analyze. I'm a writer, so I need to, talk to so many people and everything, including politicians. And I would, the whole planning even of how to use the pandemic through the media, because the media in Lebanon is state-owned, all of it. There's you can't start your own independent media. You will need, by law, the acceptance of a political party. So every TV station belongs to a political party. So these TV stations, out of like overnight, they shut down any news reporting about the protests, about journalists being arrested, so all this got shut down, and then the whole focus became on the pandemic, which is, we need to raise awareness, and we need to, but you can't also raise awareness about the health matter, forgetting about, human rights, forgetting about freedom of speech, forgetting about the right for people to, protest, etc. And I think something you guys mentioned earlier, which you guys did in London, but we did not have, My Life, My Say in Lebanon, because you did the cafe electronic, so you managed to keep your advocacy going, but now it's electronic because you're from the UK, you have the infrastructure for it, you have the internet, you have the computer, but when you're talking about the population without access, like 80% of people of Lebanon don't have access to internet connection, and 100% of Lebanon doesn't have access to 24-hour power, so they couldn't go and do what you guys did. And at the same time, there was no other way except to sit at home and watch the state-owned TVs.
I'm glad that you brought that up, saying democracy moving online and using the benefits of the internet. It probably goes nicely into the barriers, the next round. Even though in the UK we're able to go online, I found it difficult, and I think some of my other colleagues have found it difficult to use Zoom and other digital tools to participate in democracy. There's that big divide that, a lot of my older colleagues are not able to maneuver. In their time, everything was, done by sending a letter to someone. Some of them don't even use emails, etc., to do a lot of their work. So I don't personally think that our democracy, the way that we make decisions, is built to be online. I think it needs to be done in person, and I think it's hindering us. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I think it's a balance, though, isn't it? Like, I think, one of the good things about, I guess, like, since the whole pandemic started, is that I think there's a long time, I think there's a role for digital democracy to complement face-to-face engagement, although I don't think it should replace it, because I think if you're talking about reaching marginalised communities and communities that don't get to have a voice, you have to actually physically get out there, to get out on the doorstep, meet people, and actually encourage or go to where they are to engage with them. But then at the same time as well, I think, digital can help you kind of further amplify and reach more people, but it shouldn't sort of fully replace that face-to-face engagement. And I think the concern is obviously what we've all been saying, which is about this digital exclusion, which is that, I feel like even in my role as a counsellor, with my council, and when I'm always speaking to the senior officers, when they're making decisions and they're like, okay, we had a consultation with 100 residents online about this specific issue, or 1,000 residents, I'm like, but how are you talking to people that we always talk to all the time, or are you talking to people who we never get to hear from, who the pandemic is probably hurting the most? How are we actually reaching those people? And the problem comes really back to what you said, Alison, which is about how do you actually measure who you're talking to in an effective way? How do you measure the question about how do you measure, are you talking to, how do you define if someone is from a disadvantaged background online? And how do you ask that question to them? Because
and I think, if I can just say, this dream or idea of digital politics reaching more people than traditional politics did, I'm not sure that's true. There are some studies who show that it's actually less representative, because it's it's a more urban, more educated, higher income kind of population that does that. And it accelerates the speed of policy making, which has its advantages but also disadvantages. Part of the reason why we have some of the dysfunctions nowadays is because politicians feel like they have to respond to anything all the time in real life, in real time, without really thinking about it first. And part of this, I write a letter and I wait for an answer. The charm was you can let the letter lay aside, think about it, and then properly respond.
Agreed.
And nowadays, there's 900-page EU documents that every politician has to respond on Twitter in 160 characters within half an hour. That's unrealistic, and so I think it has to be complemented. I think the one and the other have to come together.
I definitely think it has to be complemented, but like you said, in countries like Lebanon, where the infrastructure is not there, then for me it's like, does that model work everywhere, or is it a model that only works in places where the infrastructure can support it?
So infrastructure and also the censorships and
Yeah.
how they, how they actually get access to what you're talking about. Because how can you comfortably mobilize like a group when everyone on there is worried that the government is listening in and is gonna take them? I mean, one journalist I know, Dima Sadeh, her name, big activist in women's rights in Lebanon, in refugee rights, and so she organized a group on Zoom, and she had 10 women with her discussing how they are going to, propose to the government the new measures for the women-to-man ratio in public offices. Dima got arrested on her way out of that meeting. Like, she was actually taken to the police station all day. We had to go down actually and protest and to get her out. So infrastructure, and also who's listening into your digital, or who's watching your emails, or because right now a hacker costs what, $30? $30, someone can come into this room and look into all our phones without knowing. And I think, which moves us to the solutions about, like, we need to hold them accountable for these things. I need to be, I need Apple to tell me that no one is going to listen into my phone. Does that happen? I don't know. I don't know how these big tech also companies, because when you talk infrastructure, look how many billions of dollars these big tech companies, big giants are doing. And they are investing in countries for infrastructure and so on and so forth. But also they're putting their hands in the hands of the governments in so many places. So is there a committee, or is there anyone to actually say, okay, this is not the way it's supposed to be? Not sure.
I mean, the difference is in the past, the way, at least in continental Europe, civil rights protection was understood as a protection against the state. We protected our citizens against the state that was interfering in our privacy and accessing our data. Nowadays, we have to protect ourselves against the companies. And that's a change of mentality, because you're assuming that whatever's, China on TikTok or US on Apple, they can access those information. Well, I'm more concerned first, this might be the case. I have more trust in democracies than authoritarian regimes, but I'm more concerned what happens before that. The companies themselves analyze all those data, for consumer comfort, supposedly, but who knows?
Yeah.
It's also because there's no level of accountability, because at least with, obviously it depends on where you're from, but at least if you live in a country where you have a right to vote, or there's democracy, or there's channels of ways of holding account. Whereas with the company, it's how do you even hold Facebook to, as a citizen, how do you hold Facebook to account? They don't represent you as an elected official, so there's no way in which you can there's no level of accountability.
Yeah, and there's a funny, I find interesting, to me, surprising development. The data protection regulation in Europe, like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. It's terribly boring, bureaucratic, long name, long document, very critically discussed all the tiny details. But what the result of that is that everywhere in the world now, this is the standard. If I access MSNBC online, if I access C-SPAN, something that has nothing to do with Europe, they always tell me, because of the EU data protection regulation, we have to ask you to commit the certain data, because they want the European customers to access their product. And hence they're liable under the European law. So because the market of 400 million people is so important, a bureaucratic legislation that was somehow done by elites in Brussels now binds the entire world on data protection. It's an interesting example of how boring grey politics can actually mean something.
What's the feeling of, we're in, the solution bit now.
Yeah.
The thing with COVID is we don't know how long it's going to go.
No.
Because, it's evolving all the time, in the sense that the information that we know about the actual virus is evolving. The virus itself is evolving. There's no end date. We don't know, is it 21st of February 2021? Is this going to end? Some people say it's going to end the end of 2021. Some people say 2022. Some people say 3 months. So I guess the question is obviously
Russia already has a cure.
A vaccine.
Yeah.
And then created a bubble around Putin.
Yeah. Which came after, coincidentally, after Oxford got hacked 2 weeks later. So that was quite a coincidence. Yeah. Anyways, but yeah, I guess the question I have for you all is, like, given that we may live with this, you know, whether it's 6 months, a year, or 2 years, and obviously we're talking about all of these concerns that we have, how do we do democracy in, like, during times of COVID, and what would we like to see happen to have more clearer lines of accountability, but also going back to right at the heart of what we do as an organizer, how do we engage with people who typically just, you know, even now they don't even have the time to engage with democracy because they're so concerned. Some of these people may be like have been left off their job, so their main concern is, how am I going to get my bills paid next month?
Survival is
Yeah.
basically the concern.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's essentially how we engage in people in civic society and democratic processes during the pandemic, and what does that look like in the future? Is it new innovation? Is it tapping into, like you said, some of the giant techs? Are they really investing into the infrastructure in the countries? What do we want to see democracy? How do we engage those who were engaged before, who were not engaged before, and the checks and balances which were weak? So how do we make sure they're not amplified even more during the pandemic and in the future, and make sure that lots of people have their voices? So that's the next round. Let's all think of those solutions. I've already got a few in my mind.
The big question.
The big question. Fun. I will kick off. Mine was definitely in terms of looking at streaming. So one of the biggest things was that a lot of people said that they're unable to obviously know what's going on. They're having to find out from their neighbours and find out on the news. And they wanted to very much be involved in the conversations and hear what's happening. And I represent an area which is of the lower class. It's a predominantly poor area. And a lot of people don't have internet access. Some people don't even have televisions. So one thing they said is, can't there be a local hub where people can stream what's happening in the local council? And I thought that was a very good idea. So something like that, obviously adhering to social distancing measures, but somewhere where people can go and see what is happening in the town hall. So I think it's tapping into the big giant tech companies and seeing how we can work with them to build that infrastructure. So that's something I would love to see in the future in my area, if we're obviously going to change the way democracy is being exercised in our communities due to the pandemic.
So streaming would be great, but then some governments will just make a rule like 4 people gatherings is the maximum. Easy, done. I shut you down. So, how can we? The question is, how can we get the streaming into the homes in case of these regulations that could come up at any time? I mean. Again, I give the example of Lebanon, having been there during this time. I see it, like the moment any person wants to organize social distancing involved and everything, they want to organize a meeting like this, to sit down and talk, or there will be a law the next morning, because when you also talk about dictators, they make up the laws they want. So you wake up in the morning, you're getting ready for your meeting, and then there's a new law where you can't gather more than 3 people in a place. Yeah.
Being a visionary, because that model would work maybe in the UK, but what would you like to see if something like that wouldn't work in Lebanon, for example? What would you like to see for democracy or people to participate?
I would love organizations like you to go to these giant tech companies and tell them to donate phones and computers. These are the tools of today's century. Like today, if you don't have a phone or you don't have a TV, even in England, in your area, you're saying, I believe tech has become part of our human right identity. I need to be connected. So when you're born, most countries or the majority of countries, you have your passport, you have tools that helps you navigate life. You have your social security number, you have all these things. Where is tech in these, natively given tools and elements?
But what is also interesting is that this crisis has brought out exactly the reach of big tech. I mean, how is it that a boarding pass issued to me at a deserted JFK this week, when you arrive in London to change planes, you put this boarding pass up to a scanner, and it clearly has enough information to let you into the precious UK-administered space in Heathrow. And you're going, well, that's interesting. I mean, as far as I know, the only place that data got put in was in JFK, but it wasn't in JFK. It was already ready.
Yeah.
And who knew, you know, what to read what when you arrive in London? I recognize that I'm sounding digitally dumb.
No, it's very important.
But I think what I'm alert to as somebody who operated in the old world of, if you cover dissidents, for instance, you try and meet with them, you tried to make it not too clear to the secret police of communist state X that you were doing this, you probably were being watched anyway. But now we're all kind of on warp speed in terms of the potential clashes between authorities, the technology available, and the people who are using it. And it's really interesting, because what you say just reminds me of covering dissidents in under communism with a much slower pace, the one that would be the best one for examining suggestions. And I can remember covering, you know, Chartists in Czechoslovakia. One time they'd had sort of a news conference, and then they said, you know, we'd like you to clear out now because we're going to discuss a paper on higher education in Northern Moravia. And I'm looking at my journalist colleagues going, you know, are these people insane? Why are they discussing this? This will never be relevant, blah, 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 blah. Within 2 years, most of those people had a position in government in Czechoslovakia. And it turned out to be incredibly useful that they had spent this time thinking about how they might regulate things like education. So how do you use these wonderful tools that we now have to convey that this is an opportunity for you to plan your future?
Education.
Education.
We said it in our panel.
It's all about education.
We need, increasing the funding for, again, I give the biggest responsibility today on the tech companies. I don't even want to, put the governments so much on the front lines of this, because if anything, the last 10 years taught us, it's like governments can go at any time. Like literally, we can bring down any government we want if we really, focus our efforts on it. And with all due respect for you guys, since you guys are in politics, but I don't trust a politician, period. Like, there's no politician that I will put my trust in because, I might like parts of a politician's agenda, but trust is not going to be there. But what Henry was saying about these, the data and these tech companies and consumer, friendly and everything, there is some trust we've put in them. I hope we won't get disappointed in 10 years like governments. But I think we, like Mark Zuckerberg, Jack Dorsey, all these guys that made, their wealth and their empires out of our data, out of our content, I think it is time, especially now in an emergency state, in a global emergency state, it is time for them to be the ones held accountable as to how are we giving these tools to people and how are we educating these people on how to use these tools. And if we give them the accountability of that and we come up with a tax equation with them, because when they are, when they're giving away all these things, they get tax cuts and they love not paying taxes, as we have seen. So what Alison's saying is, it's the equation. You can't give the tool when someone doesn't know how to use the tool. Then you have a bigger problem maybe, because if I get a phone and I don't know how to use it, and then an extremist knows that I have this phone, the extremist could reach me super fast. But if I have the education and I have the awareness, then this extremist is not going to reach me. Look how ISIS recruited men and women in the Middle East. they started with their phones. They reached to people on their phones. There are areas like Tripoli and Lebanon that they were getting messages saying, you know, you have a meeting, blah, blah, in here. They played on their emotions, and then next thing you know, people are going to these meetings, and then next, the person disappears from their families. A month after, they see them on TV in like Idlib or in whatever. Yeah. So lack of education.
But I must say, a problem I have with your reasoning is that you are, I mean, so this discussion whether Twitter, Facebook, and others, whether there are private platforms of exchange, in which case, you can join Twitter or not join Twitter. You know, you sign the small print, and you know, or are there, and that's your argument, already part of the polis? Are they already part of where life happens, where society happens, where political decisions are discussed and debated? In this case, they are no longer a private business environment. They're like the agora on the street, right? This is where the debate happens. And the knot I have in my brain from what you say is like I think you want to regulate the business world, like this new 21st century agora, with a set of rules of the 20th century political regulation. I would always say, well, if you're not happy with Apple, use another phone. If you're not happy with Twitter, don't use Twitter. If you are afraid that your communication is hacked, use Signal or Telegram or whatever is currently the safest standards. You know, it's a matter of media literacy, of digital literacy, to know where you're risking what. I mean, like the dissidents kicked out the journalist of the room, or like in the GDR, you always knew who's listening for the state. You know, you just smelled it. The new generation has to know what can I do to protect myself, and that is not necessarily regulation. It might be something just consumer behavior. I mean, some of the ways how Nike and others improved working conditions for people in Bangladesh was because consumer protests and consumer behavior, and so this could also happen. That I think we have to think more than just regulation that, I mean, is sometimes abided and sometimes not. But just two things I wanted to add on your question. You know, what needs to change in policy making? I think one element that I've observed, at least in Germany and other countries, is this contradiction of the political narrative and the scientific narrative. In the scientific narrative, you have a hypothesis based on the facts you have. You test it, you revise it, you have a new one. This is how science works. You admit when you're wrong, and then you do it better. That's not how politics works. In politics, you're punished when you admit that you were wrong. You have to have one position, and ideally for 30 years. You know, if a politician if you find something on a politician that he said something different 30 years ago, that is a disadvantage. And this doesn't work in a pandemic situation. You know, you have to be, as a politician, brave enough to say, this is the current information I have, and this is my best guess. And maybe 2 weeks later, I have another theory. And this is a matter of education of citizens to accept that. And the second thing, one thing that we have seen everywhere in the world is that COVID increased inequality in our societies, whether it is in income groups, whether it's in gender, whether it's in family status, whether it's in all kinds of other fields. The people who suffered most are those who were already at the bottom of society in many ways. What did we do? We sat on the balconies, we clapped, and we said, you know, it's so nice, all those nurses, all those single mothers. Did they get a raise? Did they get a bonus? Do they have more secure jobs? You know, and I think this is something that, you know, we just talked about populism in the session before, that fuels populism, because what the people see is, you know, we give all those money into big companies because we don't want them to go bankrupt, but we don't help the single mother who's a nurse who has no childcare facility because the kindergarten is closed, and that fuels populism.
I agree. I know you wanted to say something, Joe.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Something very, very... During COVID now, for example, in quarantine, we realized to a much greater extent how these big tech companies and how technology has basically governs our whole world. This is our life now. Most of it is online, and especially now during COVID, where where we couldn't go outside, every information that we had, every contact with the outside world was online. And for example, I was very unlucky because during quarantine, the 2 months, both my phone and my computer stopped working. Okay, so I felt completely isolated from the outside world. Okay, granted, I live with my parents, which is good because they were informed and they told me. But people who didn't have a computer, didn't have a television, didn't have a phone, didn't know what was going on outside, and they could have heard something from their neighbors. Or this is very tricky and dangerous because it can fuel misinformation. If you don't know and you can't fact check things you hear from other people, they could be right, they could be wrong. We have many people here in Greece, unfortunately, who don't really believe that COVID even exists. And that it's a plandemic, it's not a pandemic, okay? And it's, okay, the 5G network, or they're gonna inject the chip in our system. 5G because, I was working as an au pair during the summer to 3 beautiful kids here in Greece, whose parents didn't believe that it actually existed. And one of the father had a very prominent position in a pharmaceutical company. And he said it's all about the money. So apart from not having, a device where you can be informed, having a device, Twitter, Facebook, and so on, it also fuels misinformation. So you definitely have to be more transparent. And I don't know how it's going to happen. I'm just.
And that, can I just add, because I think what you're saying is very important, like and it's very country and culture specific. Where do I have a reliable source of trusted information? And in some countries, like in Northern European countries, it's the state, because we trust in our state. That's in Scandinavia and Germany. The further you go south in Europe, the less you trust the state. The more you trust civil society, NGOs, free media. But if the media is not free, then you have it. So it's in each country. It depends on where you find the right information.
But we just had the presidential debate, for example, in America. And it was literally like, the amount of lies that were told in the debate. And they had a fact checker after he went through everything, and he was like, well, that's false. And I was thinking, wouldn't it make sense to just have a fact checker at the debate? And someone says something, and you could just ask the fact checker, and then you could say back to the candidate, well, you just said this, which is a lie. But I think, I think there's a balance, and I think, I definitely agree with you in the sense that there has to be, I hear what you say as well, but I do think that there has to be some level of regulation. And the reason why I say that is because these companies have, in many ways, everyone talks about state media and sort of like traditional forms of media, influencing people's behaviors, whereas actually now social media companies are as influential in terms of shaping people's behaviors as mainstream media, if not even more, because of that. Like you said, there are like all sorts of theories. No,
I agree. I mean, there should be proper legislation. Don't get me wrong. There should be regulation legislation. What I'm just trying to say is,
we should be more.
If people say, on Twitter it's so unfair because whatever I say, I have to say it so shortly, and I get immediately attacked by a million people. It's like, well, don't use Twitter.
But we can't tell someone not to use Twitter, because if we say that this is a human right, which is the access of these things, no, I want to use it. I want to, if someone has bots, I want them to be held accountable, and I want to be able to sue. I actually, right now, I'm involved in.
But if you hold a political speech in a bar in Beirut and people shout you down because they don't agree with what you have to say, then I would say,
I call my lawyer right away. Honestly, I would do that. I'm the guy who will call my lawyer to come in, because one violation in a little corner is a violation anywhere. If I accept that violation sitting at a bar, then I do accept the violation elsewhere. And I can't be silent. I'm someone who grew up in a camp, and I was taught from a young age, I need to be vocal about how I feel. So when I'm on Twitter and I want to give a criticism for someone, I'm hoping that I'm also inspiring someone else who desperately need those 160 characters more than me to be freely saying their opinion and what they feel like.
But you're powerful. You're able to do that because you've had the experience. You may have the confidence and the education to do that. So I think what Henry is saying is that for some people, the bar or being mobilizing, and I'm big for mobilizing communities and bringing them together and investing in our communities. What I would have wanted to see is more investing in our communities and supporting them during the pandemic so that we tackle some of the inequalities and we allow people to then, once we've tackled the inequalities, they're more able to be engaged in what's happening with their governments and come together to discuss. And I think that's what he's saying. He's saying that for some people, what I find on Twitter and social media is it's kind of like an echo chamber where you're all just talking to the same people. It's the same views you're seeing, and that's because the way your data is being used and the algorithm. So really and truly, how many people are you really reaching with that view? Whereas I would rather come together in a community and talk about those issues and say my view and not feel like I will be oppressed or feel fear that once I say my view in that room, something will happen to me once I leave. So I think for me, what I would love to see in the pandemic is more of us coming off social media and talking like this in person and feeling free to do that and coming up with the solutions. And that's the challenges that the measures that have been put in place, exactly. But then the struggles of having people online is, are you actually reaching the people you need to reach? And I feel this pandemic is very much at disadvantage for people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah, I think it's also, I think this crisis is also, we're all kind of going back to the worth of the good old phone call where you didn't have to bother to line up the image, where, you know, if you're the one who's still in her pajamas, nobody's going to be able to see, and and so on. But no, I mean, on a slightly more serious note, I find it interesting that maybe it's a good idea not just to talk about all the things that we can use to communicate, but to talk to people about how they can really value communication as being sort of activism in and of itself. I think we've sort of forgotten that, and it's really, it comes back to education, it comes back to language. I mean, language is the tool that human beings have that distinguishes human beings from other forms of life. I'm sure we can have a long debate about how do sort of long-haired storks communicate with each other, but you know, for the moment, human beings have language. It has power. It should be spread. We should spread our words through ideas, not violent actions. And this whole crisis is an opportunity to. I mean, we all spent more time at home. We all in New York, people learned to bake bread. You know, the whole sort of, and every minute change in behavior was chronicled on various society pages of the New York Times. You kind of know everybody's mood and what they went through over the last 5-6 months. We should make sure that the language is counting for something rather than just kind of amusing us. And it has got to be place specific. In other words, concentrated on things that work. I mean, different things work in Germany. In a slightly sort of facetious mode. I mean, this is a crisis that is made for the German skills of tabulating and minutely recording something and drawing a logical conclusion. I mean, it really is just easier, I think, for Germans to fall into a trusted testing package. And then you have sort of interesting things. I mean, I wonder what the disclosure this morning for President Trump and Melania. I mean, we all hope that they also are not too sick, but
they can be a bit sick.
No, but is it also going to be traced back to, this is why the debate that he conducted was, you know, that he was not behaving in a way that was regarded as normal.
For example, I want to go back to what you said, Chakra. I mean, how are you supposed to trust a politician when he actually says that, okay, if I don't, I'm going to cheat so I can win. And even if I don't win, I'm going to turn the system upside down in order to get re-elected as president. I mean, how on earth are you going to trust someone if he actually says something like that?
I think what Henry said, that during this crisis, what we've seen now is it's not, politics has changed in the sense where I know there's this distrust, but now you have the science, which is playing such a big part in it. So for example, when the numbers were skewed in the UK, and you saw that we were having, apparently our cases were a lot lower, you had the science coming out and saying, well, no, the number's a lot higher, and you were seeing that information. So I think now politicians, where it would be okay to lie and someone, well, you said this back then and that was fine. Now they have to be so careful. And I've seen it in the UK when journalists are like, oh, but you said this. And you see the politicians literally quivering and their faces going bright red, and they're like, oh God, I've made a real mistake, because they know that lives are at risk. So I think, for me, I think personally, the trust and confidence in certain politicians has gone up, because now they know that they can really be held accountable, because the science is playing a big part in what is happening during this pandemic.
But I think there's also like a big wake-up call, and this is my last comments on this, is that I think one thing, and not just with this pandemic, you see it with Brexit, you see it with Trump, and these are my personal views, by the way. That's obviously like things that have been happening over the last 4 or 5 years. I think partly the problem is like there's been such a growing disconnect between the traditional route of going to be a politician and the disconnection that they've had with citizens, taking people for granted, not really kind of trying to understand, you know, just coasting by. Like, we don't have visionaries no more. Well, we haven't had it for a long time. You know, people have been quite content with just kind of, you know, coming to big boardrooms, having nice meetings, talking about these theoretical things, not really trying to make a big effort to reach out to marginalized communities. And then as a consequence of that, when you do have like deep kind of economic sort of like problems in sort of smaller towns and like middle America, or like sort of Brexit, where we see in the UK, for example, right? In the UK, like, I mean, for me as a Londoner, it's like you can't comprehend why anyone would vote for leave. But when then you go outside to, let's say, you know, anywhere outside of London, everyone wants to leave and come to London as a young child. That there's a huge like problem in terms of like a geographic divide. And I think the problem is because politicians haven't spoke to that, what then happens is you end up getting people like, you know, your Nigel Farage's or your Donald Trump's or, you know, your Marine Le Pen's and stuff coming out and really playing into the emotion of those people. And people just think, okay, this person's saying something different completely to what, you know, all these traditional politicians have been saying that are so disconnected from us. So I think this is a big wake-up call for everyone to really think about, you know, how do we create more authentic voices in politics that connect to their communities? Because we see it even in our party, in the Labour Party in the UK, where there was a period where, you know, we were in government, we're doing really well, and then what happened is in every election, the new MPs that were emerging from my party, for example, were people who were previous special advisors to the ministers, who then become MPs, but they've got no connection to people. And it's like, we just enter this cycle where eventually 15 years later, we have a political party, or the leadership of the party no longer is the representative.
No activist experience.
And then what happens is, as a consequence, you get someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who is completely like different, because people want something different. And then, you know, he was kind of the different voice, and he kind of capitalized on that. So I think there's a big self-reflection to do for everyone, but I think we need to wrap up.
It gets so this is what happens when we do tomorrow.
Can I just one appeal? I mean, one is the bubble, because I mean we're all in our bubbles, and you know, I don't know any of you, but I know that we're all having our own bubbles. They're different bubbles. They might overlap in parts, but they're all bubbles. But the other thing that we all have in common here at the table is that we think rationally about problems. We are trained like this in our university, in our education. We reflect, we analyze. This is not how the majority of people make decisions. That happens further down. And the only people that use that in political debate are the populists. We are too afraid of doing this. And I think we have to be less German and more Mediterranean. And we have to admit that, you know, feelings and fears are part of decision making, and we have not to be afraid of using that and kind of talking.
That's one of my favorite quotes.
That's a very beautiful way to end it. Using our feelings as much as using the analytical approach. I agree.
And it's all influenced by the physical atmosphere in which we find each other, because Athens is undoubtedly a different setting than beloved Berlin, which also has great moments of emotion.
Well, thank you so much.
This was a nice cafe, guys.
Yeah.
Great, bravo. Thank you. Last minute but it worked.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah. So we typically, this is how it would run. The way we would run it, if we were to give you like a real snapshot is we cap it at 30 people because we don't want to have too many people to make sure it's a fruitful discussion. And the idea is to kind of eliminate the idea of having a panel of experts talking to people. What we want is everyone to be a speaker. So what we have is, if you picture like a coffee shop, like a Starbucks coffee shop or a normal coffee shop, you'll have like 6 round tables where like you have 5 people on each one, different facilitators. And as we go through the rounds, as we did, what we typically do is kind of, as the moderators, you read a question, and then each group in their own groups will discuss it within their own 5 or 6. Then we have a larger debate among everyone. Then we move on to round 2. And the reason why we do that is because, as we've all seen in this event as well, as we got to the end, everyone was, much more fiery about the topic, engaged in the topic. So what we try to do is, because especially with some young people who haven't spoke about these issues publicly before, they may feel uncomfortable to talk in front of everyone. So it helps them speaking in smaller groups. But yeah, thank you so much for making it work for us. And
Yeah. Thank you.
Really appreciate your time.
Now we'll get arrested walking.
But we will discover that these are good